My name's Tim Gould. I am Chief Energy Economist at the International Energy Agency in Paris, and I'd like to express my gratitude for the invitation to address this second International Convention on Indonesia's upstream oil and gas. What I'd like to do today is to zoom out a little bit and talk in more general terms about the drive for net zero emissions globally and what this might mean for the oil and gas sector. To set the context for today's discussion, let's have in mind that we were releasing our recent World Energy Outlook in the run-up to a vital meeting of the COP26 in Glasgow. But it was also a moment when there was a very strong run-up in global prices. So we have this twin track, in a sense, of concerns for energy policymakers and the energy industry around emissions and around near-term turbulence in energy markets. And I'll come back to both of these, but I'd like to start the presentation today by casting our minds back a few years to before the Paris Agreement was signed, and to look at where we thought at the time that the energy sector was heading. So prior to Paris, our baseline outlook for global energy markets was one in which you had steady increases in fossil fuel consumption, and that produced, as you see on the screen, a steady increase also in projected global energy-related CO2 emissions. And let's make no mistake, this would have been a catastrophic outcome from the perspective of climate change. But since Paris, quite a lot has changed. The policy landscape has changed. New technologies, particularly in the power sector, renewable technologies have come down significantly in price. So if we look at a projection based on today's policy settings, we see that global energy-related emissions stabilize in that outlook. They stabilize at a high level, and so that's not in any sense equivalent to a stabilization in the rise of global temperatures. But nonetheless, it represents quite a shift from where we were prior to the signature of the Paris Agreement. And what we tried to do in our new World Energy Outlook was to analyze the implications of all of the different pledges that have been made by governments in the run-up to Glasgow, and in some cases at Glasgow itself. And so when we did this analysis in early October, we found that if you give governments the benefit of the doubt and you assume that all of those announced pledges are implemented in time and in full, you have a historic parting of the ways for key economic and energy indicators. So in that scenario, if you assume that all announced pledges are implemented, you get continued growth in global the global economy. You get a flattening of global energy demand after 2030, but you get a 40% reduction in energy-related CO2 emissions to 2050. And that's not something that we've seen before in energy and economic history. So every decade since the start of the Industrial Revolution, CO2 emissions have risen. But what we're looking at now, if pledges are implemented, is a situation where you have that divergence, that decoupling of some key indicators. Now, this is not yet sufficient to reach global climate goals. But especially if you factor in some of the additional announcements that were made during the Glasgow COP26, then you have an outlook for global CO2 emissions that's consistent with keeping the rise in global average temperatures under 2 degrees Celsius. And that's the first time that we've seen that. Again, in our view, some detailed analysis that we did shows that that updated announced pledges scenario would be consistent with a rise in global average temperatures at the end of this century of 1.8 degrees Celsius. Still not where it would need to be to reach that 1.5 degree trajectory, but a significant improvement on the outlook that we have based on today's policy settings. And that change in the emissions outlook would also be reflected in a change in the energy outlook. So if we just look at today's policy settings, then the future over the next 10 years looks quite like the past. So continued rises in global oil demand, likewise for natural gas, continued strong growth in the deployment of key renewable technologies. But if we factor in those announced pledges and assume that they're implemented, then already by the middle of this decade, you see a flattening in oil demand and then a slight decline. And the same is true for natural gas, largely due to some changes in the way that gas is used in the power generation sector. And you would also see considerably stronger growth then in deployment of solar PV and wind, alongside some other low emission sources of generation. Now, as I mentioned, that's not yet sufficient to reach 1.5 degree stabilization. So there's still a gap with that net zero by 2050 trajectory that we modeled and looked at detail in a landmark piece of analysis that we released in May of this year. So a lot of the analysis that we did in the New World Energy Outlook was looking at what sort of measures could close that gap, particularly the gap in the near term, so the gap in 2030. And we found that there's still plenty of additional cost-effective potential to deploy low-cost technologies, wind, solar PV, and others, to improve energy efficiency, to move faster with electrification, and particularly in the near term as well, to make rapid progress with the reduction of methane emissions from fossil fuel operations. This is just CO2 on the screen, but let's not forget methane plays a very important part in near-term warming as well. So with that, I'd like to focus a little bit on the situation relating to the different fuels. And this is quite a busy slide, but what it shows across our different scenarios that I just mentioned, what happens to liquid fuels, gaseous fuels, and solid fuels. And the steps, that's the stated policy scenario, that's kind of where today's policy settings would lead us. APS is the announced pledges scenario. So that's what would happen if all the pledges were realized in full. And then the NZE is that net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, illustrating what would be required in order to get us fully onto that 1.5 degree trajectory. And you see there's very large variations across the different fuels, depending on which scenario in. But the 2 points I would like to emphasize here are that whichever scenario we're in, there's still a very important role for fuels, for molecules that come into the energy system. At the present day, electricity is rising in importance in the global energy system, and in our view will continue to rise in importance in the years to come. But for the moment, it's only around 20% of global final energy consumption. In that net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, that 20% turns into 50% by mid-century. But still, you have another 50% of global final energy consumption that's met by fuels of different kinds. And naturally enough, as you move towards more rapid energy transitions, the nature of those fuels, the composition of that fuel demand changes quite substantially. And so you see the rapid influx then of low carbon fuels, whether there's low carbon liquids of biofuels, low carbon gases, including biogases, as well as low carbon hydrogen, and then solid bioenergy as well. And over time, you see a shift in the composition of that fuel demand away from solid fuels, but the demand for gases of different kinds is relatively resilient. But the differences in demand across those scenarios also translate into quite different outlooks for global supply, as you can imagine, and quite different outlooks for global investment. And what you're looking at on the screen here is the breakdown in the composition of that investment for oil and natural gas. The stated policy scenario where you do need significant additional new field investments, that need falls substantially in an announced pledges scenario. But if you were to achieve a 1.5 degree stabilization, the reductions in oil and gas demand would be sufficiently rapid that, in our view, you could meet that entirely from continued investment in existing and approved fields. And clearly, this creates dilemmas for people engaged in the business of oil and gas supply. And the message that we take from this for policymakers is that the way to minimize uncertainties for the oil and gas industry, but also tackling emissions at the same time, is to be very focused on the measures that can curb and reduce demand for these fuels. However, at the moment, we do see a risk of more turbulence ahead for energy markets, and I'd like to explain why that is in the slide here. We've had a significant reduction in upstream investment in oil and natural gas over recent years. That investment is around half of where it was in 2014. Clearly, over that time, the oil and gas industry has become leaner and fitter. It can do more with less. But it's very striking to see that the current level of oil and gas supply investment is broadly in line with the amount that would be required in that net zero emissions scenario to 2030. And if we look at another aspect of today's investment picture, the investment in clean energy projects and clean energy infrastructure, including electricity grids, that's been much more resilient in recent years. And indeed, we're expecting another uptick in 2021, but it remains far short of what would be required in that net zero scenario. So this mismatch, the one you're looking at on the screen, clearly it creates some risks for energy markets looking forward. In our view, the way out of this impasse is very clear. We need to see a surge in investment in a wide range of clean energy technologies across a wide range of geographies. But for as long as this mismatch, as long as this imbalance exists that you're looking at on the screen, there will be a risk of further price swings and further turbulence down the road. I wanted to focus a little bit on our view of the agenda that is relevant for today's oil and gas industry. And one of the key points in our view is this question of the emissions associated with not the combustion of oil and gas, but also the process of getting those hydrocarbons out of the ground and to consumers. And so what you're looking at the moment is the global average emissions intensity of oil production, which in our view sees a gradual decline in that stated policy scenario. So the direction that we're heading based on today's policy settings. But we would need to see a much larger decline if we are to get on track for that net zero emissions scenario by 2050. And one of the key ways to do that is to reduce methane emissions. In our view, that's a very, very cost-effective approach, and every part of the energy industry needs to be looking at ways in which they can reduce their own environmental footprint. If we look at the broader picture, then, of all energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, around 15% of that total comes from the process of getting oil and gas out of the ground and getting it to consumers. 15%, very large sum. That's, broadly speaking, equivalent to all emissions from the United States. And so we do look to the oil and gas industry in particular to take the lead in bringing those emissions down. And there's a number of new international initiatives, including the Global Methane Pledge that was launched in Glasgow, that should help to achieve those goals. But I don't think we can limit ourselves to changes in the way that oil and gas comes to market. In our view, the oil and gas industry, with its history of innovation, its ability to manage large-scale projects, ability to handle oils, of liquids and gases, the logistics of the fuel markets, and also its ability to invest at scale. That is a very important set of assets that can be deployed in support of energy transitions. And in our view, there are a number of technologies, some of which are mature today and some of which still need to be brought to market at larger scale, where the oil and gas industry could make a very substantial contribution to successful energy transitions. And one of those areas is in relation to carbon capture, utilization, and storage. At the moment, as you can see on the screen, the volume of CO2 capture capacity is relatively low, and that does not increase dramatically in our stated policy scenario. However, it would need to step up much more rapidly if we are to meet those announced pledges, and then step up much more rapidly again to get us on track for net zero emissions by 2050. And a number of those areas, particularly the investment in CCUS, in fuel supply, in industrial applications, and in the future also in direct air capture. These are areas where, in our view, the oil and gas industry could play an incredibly important role. Another area which I mentioned is low carbon hydrogen. Many countries around the world are now developing hydrogen strategies. There's a lot of discussion about how that hydrogen might be supplied, but it's very important in our view also to focus on where that hydrogen will be used. Some of those applications for hydrogen are to replace existing uses of hydrogen with low carbon hydrogen, but there are also many new applications to provide flexibility in the power sector for industrial uses, and in some cases also for transport, particularly long distance transportation and for buildings. And as you can see on the screen, in our vision of a very rapid energy transition, around half of the hydrogen produced in 2030 comes from the steam reforming of natural gas with carbon capture, utilization and storage, and around half from the electrolysis using low emissions electricity. So this is another area where it's a feature of transitions which is very important to their overall success, and it's another area where we see significant potential for the oil and gas industry to play a positive role. I'd like to look at slightly different perspective on the changes that we've talked about in the energy sector before closing. And this one is to look at the composition of international energy-related resource trade. I'm looking at it in particular by value. So as we're all aware, these are numbers for 2019 showing that oil was by far the most valued commodity in the energy-related resource trade. But draw your attention to the bottom right-hand corner of that box. There's some new elements in that energy-related resource trade that I think we need to be paying close attention to. And those are the critical minerals that are vital components of many clean energy technologies. So to some degree, as we moved through energy transitions, we're moving from a fuels-intensive energy sector to an energy sector that's much more minerals-intensive because of the technologies that we need. And as we shift towards a scenario in which announced pledges are implemented, then you start to see a different picture emerging in the composition of that resource trade. So oil remains a very important commodity. The nature of those trade relationships, though, starts to change, particularly as some major oil importers today, such as the European Union and indeed China, start to make progress towards their carbon neutrality or net zero emissions targets. So you start to see a concentration in oil trade between some major exporters and large developing economies, mainly in Asia. On the other hand, though, you also see some new arrivals in this energy-related resource trade. And I wanted to draw attention in particular to that yellow rectangle, which is the start of international trade in hydrogen and hydrogen-rich fuels. So in this kind of scenario, that is largely anchored on markets in Northeast Asia, particularly Japan, which are looking to import hydrogen-rich fuels. And the sources of those fuels comes from Australia, comes from some parts of the Middle East, comes from some parts of Latin America. Those incentives for trade are created by some quite significant differences that we see in the production costs of hydrogen across different markets. And then if we move fully to that net zero emissions scenario by mid-century, the current dynamics of international trade are completely overturned. So by then, critical minerals and hydrogen take up more than 80% of that trade by value. Critical minerals by then, it's not just the copper that is the main mineral that we use today in the energy sector for transmission lines and all kinds of electrical appliances, but it's really then those battery minerals, that cobalt, the lithium, the nickel, that start to play very significant roles alongside rare earth elements. And I think the message here from our side is that you have to pay close attention to these changing patterns of international trade, and the importance of international trade-related energy security issues does not lessen necessarily as you move into a more renewables-rich and a more electrified system. And my final slide is really to talk about some opportunities that there are for those that make the leap into the new global energy economy, which we see as emerging in future. If we roll this slide forward across to 2050, this is on our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, you can see that there are huge opportunities for companies that are well positioned in global value chains of fuel cells, electrolyzers, battery packs, wind turbines, solar PV modules, so that the market size for manufacturers of those clean energy technologies by 2050 is well over $1 trillion a year, and that's broadly equivalent to the size of today's oil industry. And I wouldn't say that those opportunities are limited to the clean energy technologies that you see on the screen. Certainly, if you look at the handling of low carbon gases, by 2050, in our view, you will have companies handling a volume of low carbon gases that is roughly equivalent to half of today's natural gas market. And I think that's the thought that I would like to leave you with as I wish you a very successful conference and discussions today, that there are these huge opportunities for growth and employment as we look through into clean energy transitions in the future. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and look forward to other chances to speak with you again in the future.